Thank you, Pierce. So we're going to have an exchange, and we're hoping also to get questions from the Q&A, and but we're going to start our discussion with to go directly with a reading of an extract from the book, and we'll have a couple of those during our discussion.
I will read a small extract in French. La vie incendiaire et inénarrable de Tshiamuena, surnommée à juste titre et à titre posthume la Madone de mine de Cafunfo, en dépit de la jalousie de certains empailleurs, un mal de charisme, d'ambition et d'enthousiasme. La Madone n'était pas une chipie sur l'emprise de l'alcool et autres breuvages sans posologie. Elle n'était pas une prophétesse de malheur et des scénarios sortis d'on ne sait quel caniveau, même pas une vendeuse de rêves, d'espérances boiteuses, de chimères. Et vous savez bien où mènent ces breloques quand elles n'en finissent pas de pleuvoir dans vos oreilles. On connaissait tous le refrain. Et la petulance avec laquelle les grigous ergotaient sur ce détail, ils reprenaient à longueur de journée les mêmes propos, comme si sur Terre, il n'y avait rien d'autre à foutre que de se payer la tête de la Madone. Tshiamuena ceci, Tshiamuena cela, Tshiamuena possède des ailes, des grandes ailes. Et dans ses activités de sorcière, dès que la nuit tombe, elle décolle et voltige sur des dizaines de kilomètres sans le moindre mazout, déverse sur nous la guigne et pirate nos chances de tomber sur le diamant dans le deuxième monde.
The incendiary and outlandish life of Tshiamuena, nicknamed posthumously and entirely appropriately Madonna of the Cafunfo Mines, notwithstanding the jealousy of certain diamond panners short on ambition, enthusiasm, and charisma. The Madonna was not some little madam under the influence of alcohol and other beverages bereft of dosage instructions. She was no prophetess of misfortune and tall tales derived from some unknown gutter, not even a vendor of dreams, questionable expectations, chimeras. Well, you're quite cognizant of where such trinkets lead as they stream into your ears without cease. We were only too familiar with the petulant refrains of those curmudgeons who quibbled over such details. They rehashed the same remarks all day long, as if there were fuck all else to do on this earth but poke fun at the Madonna. Tshiamuena this, Tshiamuena that. Tshiamuena's got wings, big wings, and as soon as night falls, this witch takes off and flits about for miles and miles without a drop of kerosene, jinxing us from above and sabotaging any chance of finding diamonds in the other world. We'd heard it all. Pointless babbling, rumour-mongery, pure humbuggery. For when it came to Tshiamuena, all ears were pricked. Everyone became a scientist, a university professor, a sociologist, a linguist, an ethnologist. Each proffered their own two-bit philosophy to dissect her every word and deed. Even the most crestfallen rediscovered a taste for life, the necessary inspiration, the appropriate panache, the smooth words of a politician on the stump. Go hard on the drink if you will, but concocting poppycock just to sink a person, and an authority like the Madonna no less, that beggars belief. How can people equipped with a cock, a belly, arms, legs, and a brain spend 8 hours a day trying to hamstring someone? All the blame for the woes of tropical Africa they laid at her door. Miscarriages, failed coups, wars, Emperor Bokassa's delusions of grandeur. They speculated without a break, concocted conspiracy theories, strived to detect relationships of cause and effect between the Madonna, blessed be her memory, and any reversal of fortune that befell the Zairian diaspora. And always, and ever still, those rumours of cannibalism. What a topsy-turvy world. The Madonna, a habitual witch with a fancy for flesh and fresh blood. Even if you detest an individual for plausible reason, It is still insane to make them carry the can for each cave-in, bout of diarrhea, or act of mischief. They'd not even slept off their beer, polished their teeth, and zipped up their pants. Then they were opening their gobs to erratically gun down a living legend.
Thank you both. Thank you so much. And also congratulations, by the way, for this book, which I was really happy to read in French, and I was happy to reread in English translation. And it's a beautiful text, beautifully translated. And for those of you who might not be aware, this is the second novel of Fiston that Roland is translating, coming after Tram 83, which was a major success and a wonderful book. And for me, when I read the Villain's Dance, it read a little bit as a prequel or sequel of Tram 83, or maybe it's like neither of these two, but it certainly feels it's part of a cycle. Maybe there will be, it might be a trilogy or like more. I don't know what's coming next, but there's, we are like with two powerful novel about the world of extractive industries and mining in Central Africa, and the excesses of that world. And so I think it makes a lot of sense for Roland to come back as a translator on this book as well, given this I think an element of continuity here in within this kind of narrative cycle. The first question I wanted to ask, and it's actually good to ask this question after we had uh, a sample of the first chapter, is about music. I think because it's quite obvious from hearing you both read that music is crucial in Fiston's writing. Uh, there is the musicality of the language. There is also music as a part of the story in this book. There are discussions among characters about the respective merits of Congolese rumba and reggae, for instance. But music is really important. Um, in Fiston, you have an author's note towards the end of the book, in which you talk about also the importance of music as uh, in your writing process. You're writing at night, listening to music and listening to specific kind of music. There is South African jazz, but there is also the older generation of Congolese rumba musicians. There is Camille Ferruzzi, there is Taboulé and others. And what's interesting for me is that this kind of rumba, this earlier generation of rumba musicians, is actually rather quiet music, sort of like mellow and maybe slower music than the new generation of Congolese soukous or rumba, which in a way, the nervousness of the new generation is something that I find in your writing a little bit, but I was just curious if you want to reflect on the importance of music for you as a writer and as something that influences your writing. And Roland, I wanted to ask you how then, is also music part of your work as a translator? Which kind of music you listen to, if you listen to music while working on this novel, and also how it kind of help you maybe connect with the Fiston's world and language. Fiston, tu veux commencer?
Oui, oui. I will speak in French. I speak more than 5 languages, and I'm fluently in French, in Swahili, Chiluba, Lingala, and German. My English is boring. Pour moi, je pense que la musique joue un rôle important dans mon travail depuis ma petite enfance, parce que tout simplement,
je suis devenu écrivain par hasard. Je viens d'une famille de commerçants. Mes grands-parents, mes arrière-grands-parents étaient des commerçants. Donc, j'ai été socialisé quelque part, non pas pour devenir écrivain, mais pour devenir commerçant, businessman ou barman, parce que mes parents et mon grand-père en particulier possédaient des bars et des boîtes de nuit.
So music has always played a very significant role for me. I'm interpreting for Fiston here, just in case it wasn't clear. My parents and grandparents were business people. They had shops and businesses, and my grandfather had several bars, and so there was always a lot of music around, and that's maybe how I became a writer. Through being brought up, cradled by music and by rhythm and by language.
Oui, donc au départ, c'était juste, voilà, et j'étais socialisé pour devenir barman parce que le métier de commerçant dans ma famille s'est transmis de génération en génération. Et donc, dans le bar de mes grands-parents, il y avait tout le temps de la musique de l'époque de Mobutu. Et pour moi, cette musique jouait un rôle important parce que c'est une musique qui est plus ou moins liée avec la nostalgie parce que mes grands-parents, à l'époque, ils vivaient, parce que mon grand-père, ils étaient toujours heureux quand ils vendaient de la bière. Il y avait toujours une foule dans leur bar. Et donc, mais je suis pas devenu écrivain, je suis pas devenu barman par hasard, par malchance, je suis devenu écrivain. Et donc, pour moi, quand j'écris, je me laisse toujours influencer par cette atmosphère de la musique qui a bercé mon enfance, ma petite jeunesse.
So in my family, professions kind of are handed down. So, since sort of running bars was in my family, it would have been natural for me also to become a barman. And I used to watch my grandfather, who was perhaps his happiest when he was slinging beers to people in his bars. And there was always this music playing, the music of the Mobutu era, which was that I was growing up in. And at the end of the day, though, I didn't become a barman, I became a writer.
Et donc, pour moi, écrire dans la langue française, il y a un rapport assez ambigu avec la langue, parce que la langue française, c'est une langue qui m'est proche. J'écris dans cette langue depuis ma petite enfance, mais en même temps, il y a cette conscience que c'est dans cette langue dans laquelle mes grands-parents ont été colonisés. La langue française, comme une langue coloniale, est liée à la violence, elle est liée à l'exploitation, à la dépossession. Et donc, dans l'écriture, j'essaie toujours, grâce notamment à la musique, de m'approprier la langue.
So, I have an ambiguous relationship with French. It's a language that is very close to me. It's a language that I write in, but I'm always aware that, particularly for my grandparents, this was the language of colonization, and a colonization that was perpetrated with extreme violence and through extreme violence. And so when I write, even though I'm writing in French, this language that I love, it's at the same time I'm trying to convey that ambiguity through it.
Donc, en écrivant en français, pour moi, j'essaie un peu de domestiquer la langue. J'ai comme l'impression que la langue française, c'est une langue sale, et à travers l'écriture, j'essaie de lessiver cette langue. Et pour finir, sur la question de la musique, donc j'essaie d'écrire, de composer mes textes, de la poésie comme un musicien. Donc j'utilise la langue française comme un saxophone ou comme une basse clarinette.
So when I write in French, it's almost like I'm trying to launder or to clean a language which is essentially a dirty language, or a language which is soiled because of colonization, and I try to launder it, to render it into something else by manipulating it in certain ways. Qu'est-ce que tu disais après ça?
Non, je disais, j'utilise la langue française comme un instrument de musique.
That's it. Yeah.
Donc,
So I use the French language like an instrument, be a saxophone or a clarinet or drums or a guitar or vocals.
Oui, oui, j'écris beaucoup en écoutant de la musique
And
aussi.
I
Donc,
write a lot. I listen to music a lot as I write.
Thank you, Fiston. And Roland, what about you now in your own?
So that's it's interesting what Fiston says. I mean that's something which I was very aware of in translating Tram 83, and Fiston spoke a lot about that, and I was, in some ways it's even more apparent in Tram 83 in some ways. But it's still very much the same thing here. It's almost feel a bit like, how would I put it? It's in some ways Tram 83 was often like a kind of a bit of a free jazz piece in ways. It was kind of very explosive. It was very, in some ways, unstructured, but in a good way. And in many ways, the Villain's Dance feels more like, mixing up analogies here. I was going to say a concerto or something. I feel like sort of the arrangements are more thought out, are richer. I'm not saying one's better than the other, but it's a different way of. I guess it takes that approach further, and I guess adds more to it. In translating, I mean, I do listen to music a lot when I translate in general. It depends. What I listen to depends a lot on my mood, on the day, on my energy. It generally tends to be music I know quite well. I listen to a lot of indie rock, from the 90s, stuff that I know well. But also what was really, when the book came out initially in French, and in a couple of the years following that, Fiston did quite a lot of readings of the book, and also there was a Spotify playlist that he did of a lot of rumba musicians, and I used that kind of as a source of things to explore. And whenever there was a musician or a piece of music mentioned in the text, of course I went to check it out. And there were certain pieces that resonated with me hugely. The South African jazz musician Hugh Masekela, there's a really great live album of his, and there's this track called Stimela, which is about the train carrying coal, or carrying miners to go and work on the coal mines. And it has a great kind of, starts with a great sort of almost spoken word bit by Hugh Masekela describing these workers carrying, and then sort of he gets his saxophone out, and I used to use that quite often sort of at the beginning of a work session to kind of get into the groove a bit. There was another musician who I was absolutely mesmerized by called Abeti Masikini, who sadly she died quite young, in her mid-30s, I think, of cancer. And I found this incredible YouTube video about 15-20 minutes long, of filmed in what looked like a kind of, I don't know, school gymnasium or kind of cultural sort of hall somewhere in Paris in '92. There's this incredible live band on stage with musicians of every color, literally, and these mesmerizing dancers grooving to the music. And I was addicted to that. I just watch it again and again and again. So yeah, I don't know what else I'd say.
Yeah. I mean, something that, kind of echoing some of what you said, but I'm happy to know that there is like Fiston has a Spotify, kind of recommendations, but I mean, yeah, I guess for all readers, the novel is like full of, invitation to listen to music.
Yeah.
I went back and listened to Camille Ferruzzi while I was reading the book, and yeah, there is this also kind of as a good companion in the experience of reading the novel.
And I'd just add something else, which is maybe skipping ahead a bit, I don't know, but there's a huge amount of rhythm and musicality in Fiston's language. And so one of the challenges, I guess, translating is somehow to preserve that through the rhythm of the words and the sound of the words. It's interesting because he writes a very kind of rich, enriched French. and there are a lot of more or less, I don't say obscure words, but words that are not sort of everyday words that he uses. He will take existing idioms and kind of twist them. So I spend a lot of time with thesauruses and synonym dictionaries, trying to find interesting ways, interesting words to use in English that would sort of convey what he was doing in French.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So oh, sorry.
Vas-y, Fiston.
Yeah.
Non, il faut dire que pour moi, c'est assez particulier comme d'être écrivain dans l'espace germanophone, parce que le français demeure ma langue de base. J'écris à 80%, 90% en français et 10% en allemand. Mais en même temps, je ne pratique pas le français au quotidien. Ce qui fait que parfois, avant d'écrire, je dois chercher la langue, chercher des mots, créer, fabriquer déjà une langue. Et à travers l'écriture, j'essaie d'insérer cette langue fabriquée dans la narration. Donc pour moi, la langue précède parfois même l'histoire. Parfois, j'ai toujours des brillants de papier dans lesquels j'essaie de fabriquer des mots, j'essaie de glisser des mots, des phrases, des tournures que je voudrais utiliser. Et à la fin, parfois, il y a des phrases préfabriquées sans lien avec la narration qui seront insérées dans le texte. Voilà, c'est un peu ça le processus de-
Right. So, I mean, Fiston's been living in Austria for over 10 years, 10, 12 years. So he lives in sort of Germanic cultural space. And the thing is, but even though 80-90% of his writing is in French, he doesn't really speak it every day. He speaks German. And so quite often when he sits down to write, he kind of has to get the language into his head first, and often the language precedes the narrative. He'll jot down, I'm talking about him in the third person now, which should be in the first person. I jot down phrases, words, fragments that come into my head. And often these will find their way into the book at some point, and often in ways that are perhaps quite a little surreal, a little strange, don't necessarily fit, but they sort of end up in there.
Parfois, quand je travaille, il y a des phrases qui viennent en allemand que je traduis en français. Donc, il y a ce processus.
And sometimes there are phrases, German phrases that come into his head that he then has to translate into French.
Yeah, there was something, Fiston, that I read or I don't know if it was a recorded interview or I don't remember where it was, but you were talking about the importance of German also in reshaping your writing in French, and I think that you gave an example about the specific use of gender, or like I forgot exactly which example you mentioned, but about how you're absorbing German also in your and it's kind of transforming your way to write French. I was curious to maybe hear you speak a little bit more about that, and so a question for Roland linked to that is I guess an open question about what was your experience coming back to Fiston's work? So after Tram 83, like how different was it for you this on this second novel? You've also talked about your approach to literary translation in relation to your earlier lives and careers, where you worked with on stage, as a stage producer, or how did it translate in this case, coming back to a work that you know quite well, and an author that you know, and maybe have you noticed like the evolution of Fiston's language, in the way that he's also speaking about yes. So
yeah. So even though it's I guess only a second novel, and there was obviously quite a gap between the two, I have continued translating him in the intervening years for different purposes. I mean, sort of, I did bits of his poetry for several festivals which needed translations of his poetry. Although now Brett Maney handles his poetry translations amazingly well. So, you know, chapeau, hat off to him for that. And I've translated several other texts for that Fiston had written to go with exhibitions, or an opera libretto I translated for him. So I've kind of maintained this connection to his work over the years. I think in terms of his use of language, I haven't noticed a particular change. I think that in terms of this novel, I've noticed a change perhaps more in terms of structure, in terms of there being, I think, more of a, I guess, coherent plot, a narrative plot to this novel than in Tram 83. There's perhaps more, I don't know, perhaps more self-assurance as a writer. One senses a certain maturity of a writer, I guess. Otherwise, it's sort of, and I suppose the other thing that's changed, I guess, is that over the years, I suppose I've come to sort of know Fiston even better, and, you know, consider him a friend, and so I'm a lot more, because I think I got to know Fiston very well after I translated Tram 83. I mean, we met before I translated it, we spoke during it, but I feel like as a person, sort of, we really bonded, particularly during the, I think, 3-week book tour we did of the US with Tram 83, and so that's helped immensely in being able to talk to him about certain questions I had, or just have more of a sense of where he's coming from.
Thanks, Roland. Et toi, Fiston, est-ce que tu es devenu un écrivain allemand de langue française ou germanique ou...
Non, en fait, moi, je pense que l'identité actuellement est transculturelle, transnationale, je pourrais dire même transethnique. On ne, on n'est pas seulement aujourd'hui que français, on peut être français et africain, on peut être allemand et congolais. Et je crois en la, en cette identité plurielle. Par exemple, au Congo, quand je vivais, je me nourrissais de la littérature africaine, congolaise, francophone. Mais depuis que je vis en Autriche, je me nourris, je pense peut-être à 80, peut-être 50% de la littérature de langue allemande. C'est-à-dire que d'une certaine manière, je suis influencé par mon environnement culturel le plus proche.
Mm.
So I think that sort of these days one can become transcultural, transnational. When I lived in Congo, most of what I read was Congolese, French Congolese literature. And now living in Austria, most of what I read is Germanic literature, German or Austrian literature. And so I think sort of I'm influenced really by, in terms of my reading, certainly by wherever I happen to be living at the time. So in a sense, I'm a French writer, I'm a German writer, I'm a Congolese writer. I'm all of these things.
Ouais. Pour moi, je pense que l'identité, c'est comme une tenue, comme un vêtement. C'est-à-dire que parfois, quand je me réveille le matin, je me décide de vivre, de fonctionner comme un noir, parce que je suis noir. De manière générale, on devient noir quand on quitte l'Afrique, hein, parce qu'en Afrique, quand tu es dans un pays comme le Congo ou au Sénégal ou au Mali, dans n'importe quel pays noir africain, tu n'es pas noir, on devient noir quand on arrive en Europe. C'est un peu ça le baptême. Et moi, je me suis rendu compte pour la première fois que j'étais noir quand je suis arrivé à Bruxelles, en Belgique. Et donc, parfois, je me considère où je me réveille le matin et je fonctionne comme avec l'identité de noir parce que parfois tu oublies que tu es noir et puis on te rappelle au détour d'une phrase ou par un regard que tu es noir. Parfois je me considère comme un Autrichien. Je me réveille le matin comme un Autrichien ou quand je vais en France, parfois je suis comme Congolais et je fonctionne comme comme un locuteur de langue allemande. Donc pour moi, je change des identités je pense que parfois, selon le jour, exemple, parfois, là, par exemple, actuellement, tout ce que je dis, parfois, je traduis de l'allemand au français. C'est que pour moi, l'identité, c'est quelque chose de très dynamique, mais en même temps, c'est toujours lié à l'espace. Quand je suis en France, parfois, je fais des lectures comme écrivain congolais. Parfois, je suis invité par l'ambassade autrichienne à Paris comme écrivain autrichien. Et donc, où j'ai eu récemment un prix à la psyche, prix de littérature, prix de maison de littérature accordé aux écrivains de langue allemande. C'est-à-dire que moi, l'identité, elle est
Attends,
liée à
Fiston,
l'espace,
Fiston, Fiston,
elle est
faut que
très
je
mobile.
traduise là. So,
Yeah.
so for me, identity is a bit like a clothing that you put on, and so when I get up in the morning, I'll get up in the morning one day and say, okay, I'm going to be black today. I didn't really realize I was black until I left Congo, because in Africa everyone is black, so you're not different. And I only felt black for the first time when I first traveled to Brussels, Belgium. And I can end up in sort of some quite sort of. Then there are other days when maybe I'll get up in the morning and think, okay, I'm going to be Austrian today. The thing is often though that I may not think that I'm going to be black today. I might be Austrian today, but then someone will remind me that I am black, not directly perhaps, but something they say or the way they behave or interact with me. So my identity is constantly shifting. And I might be in France and be invited by the German embassy to some event, and for them I'm a Germanic writer, or I could be in Austria and the Institut Français invites me and I'm a French writer, or I'm at a festival and I'm a Congolese writer. It very much depends upon the space in which I happen to be at any one time. Est-ce que j'ai oublié quelque chose?
C'est bon.
I think it's a good you did a good job.
Yeah.
And I mean, in a way, there is also like a thing that this kind of the way that you spoke about your identity, we find it also in some of the characters, and we have like there is an Austrian writer as part of
Yeah.
a really interesting character in the novel. But the question that another question I wanted to ask you, Fiston, is so it's in relation to the plot of the villain's dance, which is unlike in Tram 83, where Tram was about a place that people could recognize, and people who know Central Africa could recognize Lubumbashi, Mbujimai, Kinshasa. Was sort of a bit of a mix of these three places and maybe other places as well. But it was in imaginary location, the pays ville,
Il paye.
yeah, ville pays. Here, the novel is clearly situated in time and place between Lubumbashi and the north of Angola, Lunda Norde, and the diamond mines there. And it's also clearly situated in time towards the end of the Mobutu regime, so at the end of the 20th century. So my question was, why was it important for you, I guess, this time to bring the readers to this specific time and place? And how does this moment in the history of Congo resonate with the situation today, where there is also conflict, including conflict around mineral resources in Eastern Congo, but also in Katanga and elsewhere. But like, why did you want to go back and to bring the readers back to the end of the Mobutu period and these in these two places? And Roland, a question for you would be, how did it change the work that you did here with the translation, in terms of the
Yeah,
research that you may have have done in relation to
sure.
Trump? Fiston?
En fait, oui. il faut dire que l'histoire du Congo est souvent écrite à partir de l'extérieur par des écrivains, des auteurs non congolais. Et c'est depuis l'époque coloniale. Chaque fois que je voyage, que je sois en France, en Belgique ou même dans d'autres pays, la première chose qu'on me demande quand il s'agit de littérature congolaise ou de littérature sur le Congo, on parle de Conrad. Alors que Conrad, si vous demandez à n'importe quel Congolais qui est même, qui écrit, ben, la plupart des gens ne connaissent pas Conrad. Donc la littérature congolaise est beaucoup souvent écrite à partir de l'extérieur dans une perspective occidentale. Pour moi, c'était important de pouvoir parler du Congo de l'intérieur, de pouvoir faire, jeter un pont entre moi et le Congo. Ce qui était important pour moi, c'était de pouvoir parler de cette période de Mobutu qui est significative pour moi parce que c'est une période qui coïncide avec mon adolescence. Et donc, j'avais vraiment envie de parler du Congo de l'intérieur, de parler parce que même que ce soit la colonisation, que ce soit la période de la dictature de Mobutu ou par rapport aux différentes guerres, il y a comme un certain tabou au Congo pour aborder ces réalités-là. Il y a comme une culture de l'amnésie. L'amnésie est presque institutionnalisée. Même les Congolais, ils sont très rares, ceux qui parlent réellement de ce pays. Voilà. Pour moi, c'était important de faire, comme écrivain, de témoigner, de faire en fonction de fictionnaliser ces événements-là pour moi-même, mais en même temps, c'était important pour moi de parler de ce pan de l'histoire qui est souvent occulté par les Congolais et de manière générale, je pense qu'il part dans la littérature, je dirais, mondiale.
So I found that most of what has been written about the Congo has been written by outsiders, non-Congolese, be that colonizers back in the day or writers and researchers today from former colonial countries. And you know, whenever I meet someone outside Congo and they find out that I'm Congolese, the first question often they ask is, you know, have you read Conrad, Joseph Conrad? And the reality is that most Congolese, even those who read, haven't read Conrad, or perhaps haven't even heard of him. It's not a reference that speaks to them. But there's also a certain taboo in Congo, in Democratic Republic of Congo, of discussing and talking about the period of the Mobutu dictatorship following independence. And so it was important for me to write about that period because it was a period of my adolescence. I grew up under Mobutu, and you know, I was an older teenager when he lost power, when he was deposed, and so it's my way of, even through fictionalizing its story, of talking about this episode in my country's history, which is rarely discussed and rarely talked about.
And Roland, did it change anything for you that this novel was like more like
yeah, I mean it's I mean it changed as regards, I guess, working on Fiston's work is concerned, but it's the kind of research I guess I'm used to doing as a translator. So, you know, I found myself using Google Maps a lot more. And it's actually quite incredible because even though that's a part of the world which is less well mapped by Google as opposed to, you know, what one might call the West or the global North or whatever, you know, there's still, as I recall, you know, there still is Google Street View for Lubumbashi, as I recall. You know, it's possible to go around the city and see it for myself. Bizarrely, sometimes I didn't really like that, actually, because because when you know, whenever you read a book, you have an image in your head of what a place is like, and sometimes it wasn't quite like that in practice. But that was actually probably quite a good thing. I think that having grown up and lived most of my life in European cities, you know, European cities are tarmac, asphalted everywhere. Lubumbashi isn't. There aren't, as I recall, I don't recall many pavements. The roads aren't really paved, as I recall. And so kind of it was important for me to be able to see all those places. I mean, I also remember sometimes quizzing Fiston about, so this character's walking down that street, but I can't find that street. Are you sure it's that street or not? Because some places are there, some places aren't, some are invented, some have different names. So that was quite interesting to do. And then I guess some of it maybe was sometimes image research of, there's a particular, I can't remember the exact details now, but I remember looking for, there's a description of a building, I think, in a particular slum area, and I can't remember whether it was Lubumbashi or somewhere in London Norte, where it was like a favela, like a shanty town, but a vertical shanty town, like 10, 12 stories high or something. And I remember Googling this and finding a picture of it, and I can't remember. It was a Central African country, but I can't remember which one it was. But it might have been in Angola. Actually, I think it was in Angola. There was a picture of this. The people had just built basically a tower block. And it was like a vertical favela. So that was useful to do. And obviously some of the historical detail of, there's reference to the UNITA rebellion, to the FPLA. Have I got the abbreviation right? The different sort of rebellion, sort of the Angolan Liberation Forces, and were fighting each other. There's reference to the secession. This is a secession of the Katanga province, briefly for several, I don't even know if it was as long as several months. So all of those things one had to research. But I mean, that's, I've been a translator for 25 years, and most of that not literature. So, I'm quite used to doing research on the text I work with.
And there's one dimension that, and it's going to be my last question before we go to the second reading, and then we get to the questions of the audience. But something about the context here, I think that's also for me that was really important, is the Luba and Kasayan context as well. I think that's very clear here in the story, and through like various kind of characters, but mostly like one, maybe the most important is Tshiamuena, and you read about her at the beginning of the session today.
Yeah.
She opens the first chapter, and I guess the question, Fiston, is like, so she's this figure in Angola. At some point, you have this phrase, she's Angola, or she was Angola for the diggers there.
Yeah, she embodies Angola. Yeah.
Yeah, she embodies Angola, but she's Luba woman who's also a migrant to Angola from Congo, and she's a kind of patron saint. She might be born like in the 1920s, or maybe in 1885, or maybe in 1492, maybe in Japan, or
She's a mythomaniac.
Yeah, we don't really know.
Possibly.
But yeah, so how did this character come to you, Fiston? Where did she came from?
En fait, il faut dire que dans mon travail, je suis beaucoup aussi inspiré, surtout dans ma poésie, par mon histoire personnelle, hein. Il faut dire que je suis né dans la province du Kasaï et mes grands-parents ont migré vers le sud, dans le Katanga, pour travailler dans les mines. Donc voilà, c'est que mon histoire personnelle est liée aussi à l'histoire de la colonisation. Et donc, et puis j'avais l'un en fait, de mes grands-parents, ma grand-mère, c'est quelqu'un qui était très, très rigoureuse. Elle était très rigoureuse, donc je me suis un peu laissé inspirer par cette figure, euh, cette figure féminine qui était ma grand-mère.
So I'm very inspired by the story of my own family. My grandparents, c'est tes grands-parents qui migraient
Mes grands-parents, oui.
My grandparents migrated to Katanga to look for work, and my grandmother was very what's that word in English?
Elle était rigoureuse.
Yeah, she had a very strong character. She was difficult translating on the fly. The French word rigoureux, literally rigorous, but you know, she was, you know, I guess disciplined, self-disciplined, I suppose, and you know, a sense of where she was going and what she wanted, how she needed to get there. Yeah. Et t'avais autre
Donc,
chose à
c'est
dire?
ça, c'est ça.
She was
Ouais.
a...
Non, pour moi,
Vas-y, Fiston, ouais.
Vas-y.
il faut dire que dans l'univers, dans le monde de la mine, il y a très peu de femmes. Moi, j'avais envie d'avoir un caractère féminin pour essayer un peu de contrebalancer cet univers qui est très masculin. Parce que le monde de la mine, c'est pas le monde des bisounours, hein. C'est-à-dire que, et puis surtout à l'époque de la guerre d'Angola, il y a beaucoup de gens qui mourent en Angola. C'est-à-dire qu'on pouvait mourir de marcher sur une bombe, sur une mine, ou, euh, ou décéder dans un éboulement. Donc, c'est un univers assez rigoureux, c'est un milieu assez masculin. Moi, j'ai envie d'avoir ce visage maternel.
So the world of mining and the mines, particularly back then, but certainly still today, is a very masculine one. It's a very male one. It's a very harsh one. There's a lot of death and injury. You can die in a cave-in. At the time, a lot of the guys fleeing to Angola to look for work were having to travel through active combat zones. They might step on an anti-personnel mine. So I really wanted to introduce a strong female character into this world as a kind of counterbalance to that.
Well, thank you. And so we'll have a bit of time for questions from the audience, but
do you want to do the other reading, next reading
yes,
first?
let's do that first. Yeah. So from chapter 12?
Yeah.
La rue, la rue nous appartenait. Elle était dans notre escarcelle. Elle était notre propriété privée, notre chose, notre marchandise. Nous la remplissions de nos rêves, de rêves décassés, de rêves privés de mazout, de rêves sans tête ni épine dorsale. La nuit, l'alcool et la colle nous donnaient des ailes, nous transportaient au-delà de fleuves et de mers et nous atterrissions par le plus grand hasard dans des mégalopoles inconnus. Le Caire, Kinshasa, New York, en compagnie de nos épouses, ainsi que de nos époux, bras dessus, bras dessous, affublés de nos manteaux de fourrure, de blousons en cuir et des pulls en cachemire, coulant à verse de bouteilles de champagne, heureux comme 10. Puisque nous y sommes, j'ai dit ceci.
So in this chapter, one of the main characters, Sanza, who's ended up living on the streets with a bunch of street kids, talks about life on the street. The street was ours. It was in our pocket, our private property, our thing, our merchandise. We filled it with our dreams, gutted dreams, dreams from those nights without fuel oil, dreams lacking heads or backbones. At night, alcohol and glue gave us wings, carried us over rivers and seas, and we landed in uncharted megacities, Cairo, Kinshasa, New York, seemingly by chance, in the company of our wives and husbands, arm in arm, done up in our fur coats, leather blouson jackets, and cashmere sweaters, pouring one bottle of champagne after another in 10th heaven. While we're on the subject, I'll say this. We made no illegal seizures of other people's trinkets. We helped ourselves at the source like good colonialists. Misappropriation? Definitely not. How could we have laid hunger to rest if we didn't help ourselves at the source? Indeed, The same people who complained of our plundering lamented not an hour later, weeping crocodile tears and shaking their heads when they came across the body of a young un on the asphalt streets of downtown. Thinking about it, we were no longer Katangese, nor were we affected directly or indirectly by the Union Minière and its imbecilic structural adjustments. We were one-night princes, kings, marquises honed by the glue that gave us ideas, the glue that furnished inspiration, the glue that quickened dreams, and always the glue that allowed us to hold our own in those nights infested with finance inspectors, solipsistic soldiers, vendors of genital parts, and assorted seekers of blood for sacrificial ends.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. It was beautiful. So we have now some time for questions from the audience, and there are two questions already, and I'm not sure if there'll be others, but there's one question for Fiston, one question for Roland. I'm going to ask the first. The question is from Greg Cantor, and he writes, "Thank you for sharing your work and for this conversation. Can you tell us about your next poetry collection, Kasala poems, and also about how your poetry and fiction coexist, and how they serve different creative purposes for you?"
Au fait, pour moi, je peux dire que la poésie, c'est un peu le laboratoire de mes textes en prose et de mes pièces de théâtre, parce que j'écris aussi pour le théâtre. Et puis, j'écris pour le théâtre, j'écris de nouvelles, j'écris aussi de textes d'opéra. Et parfois, je nourris tout ce texte-là par la poésie. Donc voilà, donc je suis à la base poète, mais qui écrit pour le roman et d'autres genres littéraires. C'est-à-dire qu'il y a vraiment une connexion. Par exemple, il y a le personnage de la Madonna qui renaît sous d'autres formes dans une de mes pièces de théâtre écrites en allemand. Donc, parfois, il y a c'est le même langage, c'est le même rythme, parfois, c'est les mêmes personnages. Pour moi, je me considère c'est un peu comme la musique, il y a des variations, ou comme un peintre. Je travaille avec les mêmes motifs. Ce sont les mêmes motifs qui reviennent en poésie, dans mes romans, ou même dans mes textes de théâtre.
So poetry is often for me, like a kind of experimental laboratory where everything begins, because I also write short stories and plays, particularly in German. I write mostly my plays in German too, and also opera librettos. And so, for example, the character of the Madonna has echoes in some of the characters in my dramatic works. And I sort of consider that, like often with composers, music composers, there are certain leitmotifs and figures in my work which can appear in different contexts, be it in a novel, be it in another poem, be it in a play text. It can be similar rhythms, even similar words or similar phrases, even similar characters.
Thanks.
Et juste je voulais juste ajouter, par exemple, dans le recueil de poésie de Kasala, là, j'essaie beaucoup plus de travailler l'histoire familiale, l'histoire de la migration de mes parents, mes grands-parents. Donc, alors que dans le roman, c'est un peu la grande histoire du Congo. Voilà.
So in my forthcoming book, Kasala Poems, it's a lot more focused on my own family history, whereas in The Villain's Dance, it's much wider concerning the history of the Congo.
Yeah, so it's coming soon, coming out soon. So
yeah,
and Pierce put the link to pre-order the book in the chat, so for people interested. The second question is about translation, and it's for Roland. It's by Noah Mintz, and I'm going to read it. Fiston talked about how he hopes to change or cleanse the French language in his writing. How do you, Roland, convey that in translation? Or what do you hope that your rendering of Fiston's novel does to English?
That's an interesting. That last bit I've never actually thought about. That's quite interesting. Um, yeah, I've never sort of thought about sort of what it might do to English, but in my English translation, I think generally in my translations, I kind of aim to replicate the experience of reading the text in the original. I think there's often a kind of a dichotomy set up, which is maybe a slightly false one, as to in translations to whether the translation should sound like the language or context it comes from. It's referred to as kind of foreignization versus domestication. And there's because there's a sort of a somewhat unfortunate history, particularly for certain languages and regions, of books being translated and smoothed out and made to sound like a nice English novel instead of where it comes from. But I want the English reader to in a sense, I don't necessarily want them to know that they're reading a translation. I don't want them to be reading something which makes them think, oh, this sounds a bit French, or it sounds a bit African, and it sounds a bit. Obviously, they will know from the context that it is from there, but I want it to have that same effect. So, if it can be trying to replicate the same rhythms or the same musicality, or I mean, it's a weird thing, craft, because for me, I need kind of a structural basis. So I have my own rules which I apply when I'm first working on a draft. So, if there's a word or a phrase which is quite everyday, I'm probably going to use quite an everyday one in English. And if it's more recherché or archaic or literary, I'll look for something similar sort of in English. But then of course, in reworking and revising, that gets blurred a little, because you can't always be too rigid. And I think if one considers maybe that sort of Fiston's writing has matured since Tram 83, I think I've evolved and matured as a translator. I'm one of the criticisms I had of my own translation of Tram 83 was that it was in places perhaps a bit too rigid, a bit too literal, a bit too whereas I feel like with the Villain's Dance that I've freed myself in some ways from being too tied to some kind of literal interpretation of it. That sort of sounds a bit vague, really. But I've not really thought what that would do to English. I think that it's enjoyable when I get the chance to invent something in English. The one example that sticks out for me in Villain's Dance is that there's a lot of drinking of beer. And there's an expression that Fiston uses that employs the verb couper, which literally means to cut. So they would literally cut a beer, or he'd only cut his first beer or cut his second beer. And so I'd ask if I said, like, this isn't something that exists in French. Is it a Congolese slang expression? And he said, no, it's just something I came up with. And I can't remember whether it was his explanation or but there was I ended up going down a weird path where there's in Tram 83 there's a bit where he lists sort of a lot of the kind of professions of people that go to Tram 83. And one of them was, I think there were highwaymen, there were carjackers, and carjacker would be coupeur de route, literally route cutter, as I recall. And so I thought, okay, yeah, carjacking, hijacking. That's how I ended up with using the verb to jack, as in I jacked a beer, I jacked a second beer. And there was also a weird connection with the chef and writer Anthony Bourdain, or Bourdain, as I think you Americans call it. You know, I have a weird issue with the way in which sort of in America sort of one pronounces foreign names according to a way, but that's a whole other thing. Anyway, there was a bit in his first book, Kitchen Confidential, where he refers to one of his sous chefs who liked, when making a fish soup, he'd like to jack it with a bit of Pernod, like for that aniseedy thing. And I thought, okay, that kind of suits it to me. There was a slight objection from actually my editor at Deep Vellum, who was a bit concerned that it was too close to jacking off, and so what were these people doing with their bottles of beer? But I stood firm on that.
It's good. Well, I think it's really great concluding words. And we're getting to the end of the session, but yeah, I want to thank you very much. It was really great to hear you read and read together, and yeah, it was really a pleasure to be in conversation with you. I also want to thank Pierce, and encourage everyone to get a copy of the book, of course.